Hi, and welcome to the Blurry Turtle Podcast. Today's podcast sponsor is that moment where you drop a bottle cap and it bounces around and actually lands face up. Phew! So, great performance for Jannik Sinner. Popyrin's backhand just doesn't hold up there in the rallies. It makes him, very impatient. It makes him have to come up with big shots on his forehand, and have to be pretty much as clutch as you can be to be competitive in that matchup. I think that'll be the case for players going forward against Sinner and Alcaraz. If you have any glaring weakness, like Popyrin's backhand, it's just going to get exposed and it's going to be the reason you lose. It's the same as watching Berrettini play, Nadal and Djokovic a few seasons ago. He's very competitive, but, you can see he needs to execute every single opportunity he gets, and that's just really difficult to do. So a good win for Sinner. Slightly tougher matchup here, I think, because, Denis has rally tolerance that Popyrin doesn't. Shapo has underperformed, most of his career. The expectations are really high, so it's tricky to just lump it on him as having a bad career. He's having a great career. He's in the top 30 in the world pretty much always. Wins a title occasionally, at a smaller event. But just frustrating losses, and I think it's the manner of the losses that allows you to criticize him. He loses focus, he struggles with double faults, he gets impatient, he yells at his box. It's all the toxic behaviors that really hold you back as a player because you're not taking ownership of your own, shortcomings. Double faulting in a big moment is pressure related, but are there things you can do to avoid that? Yeah, absolutely. And it's, mental training the mental side of the game is really important. I think if you have to get a sports psychologist, go get one. I think if you haven't gotten one yet, you go get one anyway. At this point, these guys are making enough money that they should have every resource available. Maybe he's working with somebody, maybe not, but I tend to think some of the players who have, coaching from their parents tend to be a little more, tend to get their information a little more streamlined from that one source, so even me, I think I have decent perspectives, but if someone's just getting all their information about the world and their perspectives from me, they're going to tend to have the same, faults as me, the same, blind spots as me. So better to have a lot of different influences. And, Denis really should, because he could be a top 10 player every season if he got the mental side of his game going. He's playing well here. He beat Royer. A 4-set win looks good, but Royer probably should have won the first set, and that would really change the dynamic of this match. I think Shapo was, dominant physically there. If you run them through physical tests, Shapo's going to beat Royer in every single aspect. He has more stamina also. So just, if you remove the serve from Royer, he's not really thriving in that matchup. He's just a smarter tennis player. And, that's a bad sign for Shapo because now he's playing Sinner, who not only is an excellent player on his own right, but he also has one of the best teams behind him. So going to be very tricky here. Shapo won their last meeting in 5 at the Australian Open in 2021. Since then, Sinner has won that tournament twice. So, just players trending in pretty different directions. It's an exciting matchup because Denis is fast. He does have excellent defensive skills on both wings. Great power. Seeing Sinner play a strong lefty is always interesting, because it just presents a different dynamic to the normal opponents he faces. I don't think Shapo can win. I think the errors will come out in big moments. I think he's trending in the way that Tsitsipas kind of did. Tsitsipas had a lot of matches right before he started seriously slumping where he would play, a very good set of tennis, and then when it would get to the 5-hole game or the tiebreaker, he would shank a few balls and get frustrated and lose. And I don't think it's an unlucky situation. I think it's just that you are having to redline to play at the same, capacity as these other players who are kind of out training you and kind of ironing out their errors more than you are. And, when you get to the end of that set, you run out of shots, you run out of focus. It's tricky. So not an easy matchup for Shapo. I think the rallies will be really entertaining. I think he'll do well because there's not a lot of pressure, and he does have a huge game. It's the same as Oj Aliassim. You put him in a big match, and he's not as helpless as the other guys on tour because his ceiling could be much higher. Still, I think Sinner wins in 4 sets. At worst. If Dennis loses the first, I think things will get really, really bad because he does struggle with confidence. He gets frustrated. No one likes losing, but the players who've already had a long history of difficult losses and slumps, they see that doom looming more often than other players mentally. Bublik and Paul should be really solid. Paul won their last 4 meetings, but they went to 3 in Miami this year, so very good chance this is close. I actually like Bublik here. I liked, what I saw against Cilic. I talked about how motivated he looked. He looked like he wanted to play well. And, he took a break after Wimbledon, which is a bit strange for, a player who's not, Djokovic or one of these guys that's hunting majors. It's strange to see them just kind of manufacture a break. But if it helps him play more focused tennis and if it helped him train, I'm all for it. He's a tremendous player, great serve. He beat Skulkate, who I've been pronouncing Skulkate for a while. I realized it's from hearing the beer Tecate, and I don't think Skulkate is associated with any prominent Mexican beer companies. So my apologies to him and his camp and his family and the entire nation of Australia and anyone else who's personally offended by that. And I think that's enough, people. I think I'm good on apologies now. Bublik is playing better than Tommy Paul at this point. We saw Tommy, fumble the bag against Nuno Borges. He was up 2 sets and a break. We've seen this a bunch this tournament. I think it's really interesting at the majors that this can happen to players. They're dominating, and then they just fall apart, and they wind up in a 5th set, and the 5th set does not look comfortable for them at all. Tommy looked tired. He was having some leg issues. Didn't really want to deal with the situation. At one point his coach got upset with him and told him to stop crying. They actually just told him to stop crying and play. The coach was sitting there with his arms crossed for a good chunk of the 4th set. He finally got back involved in the 5th and, cheered Tommy on. Tommy played an interesting 5th set, a lot of errors. He left Nuno in rallies. He let Nuno kind of dictate also, just kind of outlasted him in the end. And, you have a plan, I guess. The other player is hampered by the 5th set. Borges was cramping a bit in his leg and couldn't really move that well. But it becomes hard to beat that player, if you're a bit fatigued, if you're not executing perfectly, and it's hard to pick the right shot. Every error Tommy gave him, every forehand he put in the net or sent wide, which was the issue in the last set. I feel like I only saw Tommy hit forehands in the 5th set, and he shanked a lot of them. So I think it gives Bublik a good chance. If I watch the Tommy Paul match and I'm 0-4 against him, I still think I'm beating him after watching that match. It just wasn't really great stuff. And the play in the beginning of the match wasn't outrageously good either. He just hits the ball bigger than Borges overall. That's, Nuno's problem on tour is he hits the ball pretty flat. Not a ton of power. He's stronger than the other baseliners. He serves better and bigger than the other, defensive baseliners. But then when you go 2 levels up and suddenly he's an underdog in every single category that he has. So great fight for him. Tough loss. But Tommy was kind of doing it to himself at the end. I think Bublik being more focused here gives him a decent chance. Obviously, he serves way better than Borges. Tommy will reset. I think sometimes, getting through that risky match can sometimes free you up a bit. But Tommy hasn't been that great this season. I see this as being a serving matchup and a matchup where, the more consistent player just ends up winning. And usually that's Tommy, right? Usually he's rock solid. He has a very solid backhand, very fast. He can cover the court. I don't even with the 5-setter, I don't know if he'll be physically fatigued here. I think maybe just not as confident as he usually is. So I'll have to see if there's some major stylistic issue for him for Bublik against Tommy. But, given the close match in Miami, I think this goes to Bublik in 4 sets. I think he'll just capitalize everywhere that Nuno didn't. And, his defending so far has been admirable, honestly. He's putting the ball back in spots where you can't really produce. And Tommy can get a little bit impatient. He tends to run around his backhand a little bit when he doesn't really need to. He, tends to try to create sometimes. It's good aggressive tennis, and in the 3 out of 5 format, that's solid. I just think here Tommy's, path to victory is grinding Bublik down and waiting for him to, check out of rallies early. And, Alex isn't doing that right now. So I think he'll win. Musetti and Cabali somehow have never played, which is interesting. They played in an exhibition in 2020. Musetti won, 7-6, 6-4. Obviously, they're much different players now. I think Musetti is still slightly better. He had a very easy match also. Very easy match against Goffin. Coming into this fresh, playing a guy he's familiar with. I think Cabali's backhand is a little bit worse than Musetti's. You usually like the 2-hander against the 1-hander, but Musetti doesn't really miss that much with the 1-hander. The slice is not bad. It's extremely fast. Like I've said, compatriots playing each other tend to have a lot of swapped sets. The players are just very familiar with each other, and even if you're dominant and able to outwork somebody, there's sort of that, sigh of relief where then the other person is a little more motivated. I guess that's all tennis, but I do expect this to go, 4 or 5 sets. Cabali's serving very well, hitting his forehand really hard. He just hit through Brooksby, which took forever. Obviously, a 5th set tiebreaker is exhausting. I think Cabali was a little bit flat against Brooksby at times. He just looked like he wanted to get out of rallies. And Brooksby's an interesting player because he hits the ball flat and he plays possum. But then when you put him in a slightly bad position, that's when he tends to go bigger. So just an interesting kind of mental battle for Cabali to know that he wants to open up the rally and he wants to start playing offense, but also knowing that the moment he does, that's when he has to get back on the defensive. So it was a really interesting kind of cat and mouse game that they played throughout. Either player could have won, but, in the end, Cabali gets through. I think Musetti has a similar level of defense to Brooksby and, more power. His ability to infuse pace on his forehand is exceptional, and he serves decent too. For a defensive mastermind, you think, they're putting the ball in play, but Musetti can dial up an ace or two. I would compare him a little bit to, early Sakkari in that sense where, he's grinding you down in the rallies, and then when you finally get to, a break point, he's able to just hit a big serve. That's not so much the case for Sakkari anymore, but it was early in her career. So yeah, I like Musetti there, 4 or 5 sets. The upset's not out of the question because it's hard court, but he just has a lot going for him coming into this, playing less tennis so far in the tournament, being in good form, and his opponent being a little bit fatigued from playing Brooksby. Some 5-setters are not that arduous, but Brooksby makes you play a ton of tennis. Cabali also, I think, has played, more tennis recently. Had the run at Wimbledon, just been very active. So, that could let you burn out a little bit at some point. Munar and Bergs. I like Munar. It's hard to fade Bergs because he works so hard. He's very consistent. He's the type of player, when you see that he's worn someone down or frustrated them, not totally surprising. He's a good athlete. I just think, Munar is doing the same thing to good players. Diallo's leg wasn't 100%. Munar was able to break him way more, than anybody really has this season. You mostly expect Diallo to get to tiebreakers or, maybe dump a bad set with a bad service game, but then win the next one. Just wasn't really himself there. Played a decent match, tried to go for his shots and get things done, but Munar's defense is such that you just can't really hit through him easily. His whole intent is to make it clear that the match is going to be frustrating, and he's good at that. So he was able to do that. I think he serves a little better than Bergs. doesn't hit the ball harder, in an average rally, though. So should be interesting. Bergs obviously gets the withdrawal from Draper, who I just said looked healthy again. He looked okay in the doubles. He's hitting the ball well. But, hopefully he resets. The season it's not over. There's a couple months left and, a bunch of tournaments, the Asian swing, some indoor tournaments in Europe. But, the season's mostly over. So it's a, decent time for Draper to go home and put some work in the gym and just kind of treat the rest of the season like a training session. Zverev and Auger-Aliassime should be, if either one of these guys is serving at 6-5 in a tiebreaker, I like their chances. If either one of these guys is serving at 5-all in a tiebreaker, I do not like their chances. Just two players that really can create their own problems, and they're not really sure what's best for their game. I really think Zverev played in his early career. You think to the match against Zverev, not against Nadal, right when he got on tour and he missed a volley at net, to put the match away. I feel like he played hyper aggressive at that point, and I think that was better for his game. I think him, ripping the ball and hugging the baseline made him a really tough player, because even though there were more errors, his serve kind of made up for it. At this point, he's exceptionally hard to beat for lower tier players. He's become the perfect gatekeeping player because he doesn't really take risks. He doesn't give you a lot, and then he wins behind his serve. But at the same time, when he plays the better tier players, I think he just allows them to play. He plays a guy like Griekspoor who does everything a little smaller in every aspect of the game, and the matches are even, So I think Felix can do okay here. Their last meeting was a 6-2, 6-4 win for Zverev in Miami. It's tricky to look at Auger-Aliassime matches because some of them he just crashes out of. Some of them he's just completely not timing the ball well, and that's, his game is really dependent on his serve. When he's landing for his serves, he's a completely different player. When he's hitting his forehand well, it's all you really need. He starts to merge into that Berrettini territory where you just have to get it to his backhand, but it's easier said than done. Safiullin probably should have won the second set. He had a bunch of break points late. They might have been set points, actually. Good position there. Felix just kind of got into so many situations where he was up against it and had to play, a solid point, that he started playing solid. He just was looking to make sure he didn't miss on those points. And it sort of fixed the backhand errors he was having. It sort of fixed the attention span issues that he was having in the match at that point. And then again, third set, Safiullin had a few good looks, but, just didn't have as many ways to score, I think, as Felix. Every time Felix got to hit a forehand inside in, he kind of scored a point. So, his mobility and ability to defend, and his backhand getting together really helped him get through there in straights. I think the backhand exchanges here, obviously, Zverev is going to win them. That'll be an issue. Zverev's height, and reach makes him a better returner for Felix's serve. Felix tends to hit a lot of T serves. It's much easier to return those when you're tall, so good chance for Zverev there. Felix, hard to count him out. It's a player like Chapo where the ceiling is lower than it should be, maybe. So he could, have some heroics here. Zverev does play pretty passive, hangs behind the baseline, gives you chances to play. Fernley I didn't think was playing that great and still managed to score, notch 12 games against Zverev in the, the losing effort. I think, it'll be close, a couple tiebreakers. Zverev should win in 3 or 4. He hasn't been bad in a while, even though he kind of underperforms on that, in that major stage. Can't really fault him for that. Zverev, Alcaraz, and Sinner are just not similar in terms of, mental state on the court. The other two, Alcaraz and Sinner, are just more aggressive about their shot selection. They're trying to they're trying to optimize their game also. And I think Zverev is doing that also, but in a very roundabout way. He's trying to very slowly get better at everything. And, it's turned him into a sort of serve bot pusher. That's disappearing. It's one of those players where the ways to beat him get narrower and narrower, every season. But the window's closing because Sinner is getting better, and so is Alcaraz. Alcaraz looks better on hard court so far this tournament than he really has in any tournament, in the past. And these guys get experience. Suddenly they're way more comfortable in the big moments than you, and you tend to get predictable. I just finished watching the Paolini match against Vondrousova, and even though Paolini was playing well, Vondrousova just walked to every shot she was going to hit. She just had a feeling where everything was going to go in that moment. And, that's something that I think is a problem for Zverev also. Players are sort of aware of what he's going to do with his forehand on 75% of the shots, and when he does go down the line, he has that tendency to decelerate and just guide the ball, which is, it's good. It's good to spread the court. It's good to change paces sometimes. But against the top tier opponents, I think you have to keep them honest. You have to make them reset to the center on every big swing. You have to kind of show them enough offense, in every situation that they're not really able to just sit on the shot that you're most likely to hit, because that's when they start to redirect and really hurt you. So, here Zverev can just isolate the backhand, but going forward, I don't know if it would be a coaching shift or just a personal shift, but he needs to do something a little different. Coleman Wong with another great win. Walton kind of fumbled the first set, and from there, they just broke each other a ton. I think Wong was just able to serve a little bit better. I'm a little surprised, that Rublev is minus $1 million or whatever he's priced at here. I think Wong is playing excellent. If this were 2 out of 3, I think there's a chance they could go to a third set. Rublev's not exactly the strongest mentally at times. He did put in a decent performance against Boyer. Boyer was, up against it early. I think the key in that match, and one of the reasons I think that Rublev might be a good favorite to keep going, was that Rublev landed a really solid amount of his first serves. He just kept hitting first serves. He didn't lose many points behind them. Some people say that I should tell you the percentage of first serves, but that's something I actually didn't write down, so I don't know it. Rublev, when he's landing first serves, is going to be really unplayable here. Boyer's pretty solid in the baseline. I do think Wong is better, though. Wong has more variation, a more dangerous backhand. He also serves better than Boyer. Boyer might have like a larger delivery because he's a bit taller, but Wong has been spot serving excellent this tournament. It's one of the reasons he was able to beat Walton. While they were exchanging breaks, he was the one way more likely to just get a hold to 15. So I think he can steal a set here. Rublev did have a letdown at the end of the third against Boyer. I would expect Wong to trade well from the baseline also. I think he has more tolerance, more speed, more rally tolerance than Boyer. Just if Wong plays Boyer tomorrow, I think Wong beats him in 4 at worst. So, definitely an upgrade, but Rublev in good form. Not a huge reason to think he loses this either, since Walton, was pretty competitive there, and Rublev is kind of like a version of Walton with add 10 miles per hour on both ground strokes and, make the serve a bit stronger as well. Especially this tournament, he served really well. So I think Rublev wins that in 4. It's a big step up for Wong. Wong played great in qualifying. He's been solid this season. He's inching his way towards the tour. It's a big step up in opponent, though, for him. So it'll be interesting to see if he's able to, execute, with the same efficiency that he has. Majrzak and Reedy. I've been calling him Rieti. Apparently it's Reedy. My apologies to him, his camp, his family, his pets, anyone else. I'm not even kidding. I mean, it's I never really realized how many names I was mispronouncing until I started doing these. And there's been stuff in the past too where I had, I was calling players by the nickname and had that wrong or something I was saying was borderline offensive. I remember Kachanov at one point. I was calling him Catch, and it turns out that's a slur for people from his hometown. So that was, I'm being lazy because I don't want to type the full names out. But, there's a lot of educated tennis fans too out there who can, clue you into this stuff. I feel like I know a lot about tennis, but, there are tons of people who don't really want to be in the public eye who know a lot more. And I steal their ideas and repeat them to you. I like Majrzak here. Both players are coming off a 5-setter. Reedy's was very strange. He was, not better than Cerundolo. He wasn't winning any baseline rallies until the end of the third set. Again, a match where, Cerundolo was up 2 sets and a break. And, losing from there just seems confusing to me. But, he wasn't 100%. He had the ab issue. So I guess, there was a point at which he couldn't really thrive. Just strange to see that after he did the same thing the round before against Arnaldi. So I like Majrzak here because he's a bit more consistent than Reedy. Reedy has, tape on his legs. 5 sets for him is tough. He's dealt with a lot of withdrawals and injury issues in the past. So I don't think he's going to be, 100% for this match. And I think Majrzak's style of hugging the baseline and moving the ball very well is going to make it a long day for Reedy. If he's going to make errors, this is the match he's going to make them in. Beating Kachanov is tremendous right now. He's playing good tennis. And another great comeback. Majrzak lost the first 2 sets, and, it's an opponent he's lost to maybe 4 times in a row, I think, before that, and manages to win with a 5-set comeback. Tremendous for him. Obviously, he's having the best season of his career. And, I think, I'm not sure of the year, it might have been 2020, 2021, but he had a moment in the U.S. Open where he was playing really well, came through qualifying, and pulled an upset, and then was playing, I believe, Nishikori. And they were, in a 4th or a 5th, and it looked like Majrzak might actually, win and really land on tour. And then he got injured, so he was disappeared for, 2-3 seasons after that. And, seeing him back on tour is it's heartwarming, but it's also not so surprising because he really was hinting at a very good level back then. He doesn't have the biggest weapons. Reedy's serve is better. His forehand is a bit bigger, but I think Majrzak just plays a very solid style of tennis. I think this is sort of a, what's the right way to describe it? It's sort of like Majrzak in the sense is Paolini, and, she's playing someone like Kudermetova, who has, big shots, but you sort of feel tension on every one of those big shots. Reedy locked into a solid level from the baseline. He was willing to play a bit longer in baseline rallies against Cerundolo in the third, and I think that's what really turned the match around for him. He sort of stopped making errors in those. But I think Majrzak should win in a close one, probably another 5-setter. I think his stamina is a little bit better. Altmaier with tremendous win. Tsitsipas continues to lose. He got upset at the net afterward. I didn't see the clip, but he hit a ball at Altmaier at net. And, after the match, he said something like, I forget what it was. I'll look it up if you give me 2 seconds. But yeah, he got a bit spicy, and it was a silly one. For me, Tsitsipas has been hitting the ball at his opponents at net way too often for way too long. He does it on purpose. I don't know if he thinks it's some tough guy stuff, but he's not a tough guy, And I think, overall, he should stop that. I mean, who else? Who else does that? Sorry. If you can hear me typing and you wonder why I'm speaking slowly, it's because I can't do 2 things at once. At all. In fact, I'm struggling to even think of words right now. Luckily, I wrote some words down earlier, so I'll read them to you now. Recipient. So Tsitsipas apparently complained, that he drank water in the changeover. There was an incident about, someone stopping the match to change a string dampener. Just kind of childish stuff. And I'll keep Googling because I've already derailed this. And I want to get the exact story for you. Some might say I should look this stuff up before I start recording. But okay, this was it. It was an underhand serve. Tsitsipas said, you shouldn't be upset that I hit the ball at you at net because you underarm served me. Some people think that's very disrespectful. It's not really a thing that was done in professional tennis for a long time. So, the fact that it's come back into the tour has been a bit controversial. I think most players should just accept it. It's a decent tactic. The only complaint I have about it is that the camera guys never catch it. The camera guy will be zoomed in on something else, and then you hear, oh, from the crowd. And then they cut to the guy scrambling in. I'd like to see it. I'd like to see both players, how they were positioned when it happens, to see if it was kind of a quick serve, to see if it, what triggered the guy to do it. It's just an interesting tactic, and I think one that works given how deep some players stand and how, how regimented some of their, return routines are. But overall, I'm not on Steph's side here because, him and Rune hit the ball at their opponent when they're at net way too often. So at that point, if I know you're doing it on purpose, it's a fine tactic. I'm not offended by that. But it's the apology stuff for me that just, would not be really acceptable because I know you're not sorry because I know you're doing it. You're fist pumping, you're giving me dirty looks across the net, which is something that Tsitsipas does. You're putting on a persona and then you're trying to act like that's not the choice that you're making. It's a choice. There's a lot of shots that he has that he could hit clean past other people. Most of the tour does it. So, just trying to justify his own bullshit at this point, which I think he's done for a while. In press, I've heard him speak to people, and it's not that I think he's a bad guy. I think there's a tendency for people to think that they're, whether it's evidence-based or not, to think they're a little smarter than people. I think everybody internally thinks they're secretly a little bit smarter than other people. When you meet someone who's actually intelligent or knows a lot, you feel like a toddler again. You don't even want to speak. But, and I think that can make you a little bit condescending. I think you think people aren't aware of your bullshit when they are. And, when you get called out on it or when it becomes a prominent thing, you justify it. And again, if you think everyone else is a bit ignorant, your actions are probably going to be a bit ignorant because you're trying to meet them where you think they're at, and it's not really where they're at. Most people are pretty sharp, not about maybe every topic, but, we're smart, people understand what's going on. Even children, you lie to a child about something and they go, are you lying? And it's like, I also think every generation tends to get a bit smarter. That's not really a topic for this video, but I do think that. And I do think my phone is annoying. But anyway, yeah. Tsitsipas loses. Everyone rejoices. He's a douchebag. Altmaier wins. I don't know much about him as far as his demeanor or his personality, but I know he plays hard. He'll put on a good effort against de Minaur. Don't think he can win. De Minaur is the number one gatekeeper, I think, in the men's tour. He just will expose you. He beat Altmaier indoors in Rotterdam in straight sets, where I think indoors is a little bit better for Altmaier because he gets a boost on his serve that Alex doesn't get anywhere. So I expect Alex to win. He's making his way through this tournament, as he does at most majors, easily. Not real trouble against Mochizuki, which isn't surprising because, Shintaro doesn't really have the biggest first serve. He tends to win with his shot placement. And, you can place the ball wherever you want. Against Alex, he's going to give you back a difficult ball. So if you're not bringing, heavy power and heavy weight of shot, it's just really tough to beat de Minaur. So I like him to win in 3. If it goes to 4, I think that's a good result for Altmaier. Tsitsipas wasn't playing poorly either. That was, a well-earned win against one of the better versions of Tsitsipas that we've seen. But, the guy's just been in a slump, and de Minaur is not in that slump. That's it for the men's side. Switch over to the women's real quick. So here, Kostyuk has won both their previous meetings in straight sets. They're back in 2022. Obviously, Parry's, more established on tour now. I think, Kostyuk has made significant improvements since then also, though. Kostyuk, close match with Sonmez. I don't see a huge issue with that. I said she probably, could revert to just hitting the ball hard and grinding her down if she had to. She ended up having to, and it's what she did. Parry and Zarazua had a similarly long match. If you watch the third set, Parry was hitting backhand slices and Zarazua was hitting two-handed backhands, and they basically just saw who was able to do that for longer. I do think Zarazua was able to, navigate that situation better. I was very impressed by how consistent Parry was with it, though. She really did not miss a slice, in the 5th set. Big edge there was, her ability to get some unreturned serves towards the end of the match. When she was able to hit a T-serve from the ad side, it just really, really let her get inside the court. And, her forehand is a heavy ball when she's able to hit it. So there were a few, sneaky errors. The match could have gone either way. Parry was up 8-4 in the tiebreaker, and then the next score was 8-7, which is, very scary for her camp. Garcia and some of the other French players were in her camp just living every moment, and you could see them stressing out and celebrating. And, it's fun to see the atmosphere in a night match at the U.S. Open. It was a great match. Zarazua played excellent. She's made some improvements to her topspin forehand that I think are, the reason why she was able to beat Keys. I didn't realize she was hitting the ball that well there. She used to go to the forehand slice a lot. Overall, a good match from both. I think Parry will have a tough time scoring on Kostyuk here. Kostyuk hits the ball a bit harder. If she's having trouble with Parry's slice, could be a long day, but I think she has a pretty solid two-hander. Showed decent composure against Sonmez and probably should win this in 2 or 3. It's a match where I think Parry had a lot of time to choose her shots in the last round, and here she won't, and she can be a bit error-prone, when she's rushed. One of the reasons that her, her early results were better on clay. So I like Kostyuk in 2 there. Noskova gets a good, forfeit win. She was playing tremendous. The best I've seen in a while. She's had some good results recently, after a long slump of losses. So her playing Mukova is an interesting spot. They've actually never played before. So, again, compatriots, but this one should be very interesting, especially because Noskova tends to hit the ball flat, similar to Cirstea. So Mukova doesn't really have to deviate from her game plan. She has to keep the ball, on Noskova's backhand if she can. Play a lot of slices. That was really the key against Cirstea. Mukova, they exchanged a bunch of breaks in the 3rd set. Cirstea was up 4-1 in the 1st set. It could have had a different outcome. It just felt like Mukova was able to make a few more defensive gets. And, when she hit a ball deep, the heavy topspin caused Cirstea to make some errors on her backhand. And, when Cirstea was able to get a ball deep, Mukova just put, one extra slice, one extra loopy forehand, and, it worked. I think Noskova, more topspin on her shots than Cirstea, but also I think she's seeing the ball really big. She was hitting her forehand right by the baseline whenever she had a winner opportunity against Lys. And, I think that'll pay dividends here too. Mukova's, hinting at form again. Starting to play well, starting to win close matches. I just don't think she's totally back yet. And I think Noskova is bringing her best tennis into this one. So I like her to win a close one. Probably could go 3 sets, given Mukova's power and serving. It's really hard to just blank her. But I think Noskova is a little bit sharper here. Kasatkina and Osaka. Osaka won both previous meetings. Not terribly surprising. Kasatkina is the kind of player who's going to beat you if you can't hit through her. And Osaka's able to. She just hits the ball a ton. And if she has time, pretty unplayable. If you're able to rush her, she makes errors. But she just played a match against Baptiste where I thought she'd be rushed, and she didn't have any issues. She broke often. She served well. And, it's a tournament she's comfortable at. She's playing really well. I watched some of her press conference. She had a good take on the Ostapenko situation. Really balanced. I'm not going to repeat it. I don't want to misquote someone. She said it better than I would. But I think that is important, too, to note, a player maturing to the point where they're, I wouldn't say the voice of reason in the situation, but where they're comfortable speaking about that, very balanced. And, she's had tons of media training, but I think, she seemed a bit immature in the past. And, that shift to maturity and perspective comes. It comes. So, it's good to see Osaka sort of, what's the right way to put it? It's good to see her settling in again on tour, playing well. And, it makes the tournament better. I think Kasatkina's been slumping a little bit. She's not really thriving on tour at the moment. Good win against Rakimova, but 7-5 in the third. I don't think she's going to beat Osaka unless Osaka completely implodes. And I don't see a reason for her to. Kasatkina doesn't serve well enough to keep Osaka from driving returns. So this one is just about how long it takes for Osaka to break. And Osaka gave up a few breaks, had some issues against Minin, got rid of those in the second round. So it's a player who's getting more comfortable with the conditions. She's going to have the fan support. Everybody loves Kasatkina too. If you don't watch her vlogs, watch them. I watched half of one. Most of it was in Russian, and I still laughed like 5 or 6 times. So, Osaka should win that in 2. Freck and Gauff, I really like the way Freck plays. She's very consistent, extends rallies, never gives up. It's the reason she beat Stearns. Stearns was the better player in the first set, but, just kind of, got frustrated and impatient again. And, Freck was able to wear down her forehand. And then, she has enough power on her shots that if you give her time, she can score also. The way she plays generally would be good against Gauff, but I think outlasting Gauff isn't really the way to go. You have to have power. You have to have a heavy shot to her forehand to really make her completely miss. I don't think Freck's forehand's very big. She tends to go across it more than the traditional topspin. And that can make the ball slide nicely, but Gauff is just looking to put the ball back in play. She had some issues against Vekic. There have been some tearful moments on court this season. It has to be exhausting to train. What I suspect is happening is that in training, everything is fine. The serving is fine. There's no double fault issues. The forehand is okay. And then you go out on the court and the same thing that you don't want to happen happens over and over again. Performance anxiety affects lots of people in lots of areas. And that's why this podcast is brought to you by Blue. No, I'm not going to do that. But yeah, it basically just, the issue compounds. She brought in the right coach from Sabalenka's team to deal with that. She will iron out the double faults. If Gauff ever fixes her forehand completely and, doesn't double fault anymore, it's going to be hard to keep her from winning, 5 or 6 more majors. But at this point, it's still there. Freck is not the player, I don't think, to expose that. Just not really dangerous, And Gauff beat Freck twice in 2024 and didn't drop a set. So I'm dragging this more than it has to. It was a good result for Vekic. Had some chances in the first set, but overall, yeah, Gauff should. Oh, sorry. I had the hiccups again. Something about podcasts gives you the hiccups. So overall, yeah, I feel like Gauff will win that in 2. Anisimova, I thought it was a really good result. Maya Joint getting to a tiebreaker might not be what people expect, but I feel like Anisimova played really well in that match. Joint challenged her mobility, I thought. That was what I liked. Obviously, Anisimova is supposed to win. Joint got pretty close and had some struggles in the second set. But I think what was important to me was that Joint really hit aggressive shots cross court, and Anisimova was able to put them back in positions that let her get out of trouble. It's a player who, if Anisimova is standing still, that's a top 10 player on tour. If she's moving, sort of in that 20 to 50 range, where she's not Venus Williams. She's not just a player who that's the path past her, but it becomes a clear plan for most of her opponents. So really good to see her moving well. She's in good shape. She's having a great season, and I think after you have a close result like the Wimbledon final, a lot of people think you're going to kind of be dwelling on that. I think for Anisimova, though, it removes some pressure. Early on in her career, she had a lot of moments where people were saying she's going to be the next big thing. Some of those came to fruition. She made the finals in Indian Wells, had some good results. Obviously, has had some personal issues. The loss of her father, who was big in her tennis career, was hard to come back from. Losing a parent, losing anyone you care about will just set you back for a while. You just are not as enthused about what's going on, and that's fair to do. It's fair to take a break. How you feel is how you feel, and you want to sit with those emotions and take care of them. One of the people I like, I'm gonna mispronounce his name, but Thich Nhat Hanh or something. He was a Buddhist monk who lived in Vietnam and France, and he always talked about how when the difficult emotions come, try to care for them as if they were a small child, basically, who was having those emotions. If I'm sad, I'm not having a good time. It's frustrating. But if a small child is sad, you forget yourself. You're able to care for that child in that moment and work through it. Same as if a small child is angry, you're able to deal with them. Where if I'm angry, and I'm telling that story about myself, I'm way more reactive, way more easily moved. So, I don't know what I'm talking about, but he did. So Anisimova back, no pressure on her this tournament. The best season ever. Expectations are lifted. Getting zipped, in the finals, it sucks, but you made the finals too. Listen, I'll take being zipped in the finals of any tournament. Jacqueline Christian had a good win against Kruger. I think that the errors that Kruger gives you are not going to be here from Anisimova. Anisimova's, same level of power, but way more consistent, way more solid. Jacqueline has proven to be a really good opponent, in these situations. I think she doesn't have the biggest game all the time, but there's not really an issue with her game. She goes for her shots. She moves really well. No issues on the backhand. Decent serving game. So, in these big moments where most people's games get smaller, there's no reason for her to really fold up. She's going to be able to play. I think Anisimova wins in another close two-setter. Same situation, where Jacqueline is capable of winning a game or two on her own merit just by playing very good tennis. But, from there, I think Anisimova just has too many weapons too often. Beatriz Haddad Maia, another one. I was calling her Bella in enough videos that someone asked if that was her actual nickname. Somehow I thought that was her actual name. I've been, abbreviating it BHM in a lot of the articles, so that's lazy on my part. Apologies to her team, and anyone else that's lazy and careless. But thank you to Maple Crisp for posting that out. I appreciate that. If I'm getting something wrong, even if it's about tennis, I appreciate it. I'm trying to learn, trying to be better, because then people won't call me an American cunt in my inbox. So Maria Sakkari and Haddad Maia have played a bunch. And Haddad has won all 3 meetings. So this is a spot where Sakkari is playing great. Just beat Bondar, who had beaten Svitolina, which is a surprise result. I thought, early in the first set, Bondar was starting to get some looks, had a break point or two, and it was starting to look like another, difficult situation. But Sakkari just too solid, put her away. Sakkari's been trending in the right direction lately. She's had a bunch of difficult losses on tour, had some slumps. But, the pedigree is there. She's one of the most fit players on tour. No real injury issues, I don't think, at this point. Can get a little tricky with shot selection in big moments. That's something to look at here. Sometimes goes to the bailout drop shot. You can tell it's sort of a I want it to be over choice. And a lot of players do that in the big moment. You see the serve volley on a break point on second serve. And it's not that they're a tactical genius. It's just that you kind of want the outcome when you feel very uncertain on the court. And without realizing it, you can get impatient. And as you're doing it, you know it's a mistake. That's, I think, when you make a mistake. You snatch at the forehand, and the forehand wasn't necessarily the worst shot ever, but you realize that you're, going for too much too soon. That's what makes you kind of raise your arm abruptly and miss the shot. So good for Sakkari to get some wins under her belt. Playing an opponent, I think Sakkari coming in at her best level would normally make me pick her. Haddad Maia has really struggled for a while. She wins a match in a tournament and then loses the next round. So even though she's won a few here, I'm not totally convinced. Beating Galovic is solid, though. She makes you play a lot of tennis. And having won all 3 matches is also. The other stat I'd say for Beatriz is that she served at 74% in that match. Obviously, Galovic is not a dangerous server. So your service games are a bit, less pressured, especially, if you're winning 6-1. Of course, you're going to land a lot of first serves while you're up a break or two. But 74% is really solid, and she had no double faults. So if there is an issue for Sakkari, we saw today Vondrousova's lefty serve was able to get up high on Paolini's backhand. And as it curved away, Paolini has a short, compact backhand, and it was really hard for her to hit, any returns of value. And Sakkari also has a pretty short, compact backhand. So if there's an issue returning Haddad Maia's serve, it'll really be on display here. So I think it'll be close because Sakkari's playing so well. But, it could be a spot that's hard to overcome. I didn't catch a ton of Haddad Maia's match, so not completely sure that anyone should trust me on this one. Tend to go with the head-to-head. I talk about how Haddad Maia has been, good and poor at different times. But if you've won all 3 matches, there's something there. There's something of an issue to deal with. So I kind of like her. Alexandrova and Siegemund is interesting because Siegemund just beat Alexandrova at the Australian Open last year. Working against that is Alexandrova's tendency to play well, a few weeks of the year and rough. The rest. In a first round, she's very snaggable. Once she gets going, she tends to go deep. If you see her at a 250 and she wins 2 rounds, it's, decent chance she's in that finals. Very aggressive returner, which is tough for Siegemund. Siegemund's not really the best server. So if, even if Siegemund wins a set, very good chance she just loses the next one. It's hard to deal with that onslaught. I think, again, I want to point at serving stats. Alexandrova served at 75% against Wang. Wang's a pretty aggressive returner, so it's not like Alexandrova's just hitting the ball in and starting the play. So that's a good result for her. No double faults also. So, these serve stats, listen, 74% and no double faults is a stat anybody on the ATP would take. For the WTA, it's incredible. Usually for me, if I see a player above 60%, I think they have a decent chance to win, playing their normal game. So player in really good form. Siegemund was able to beat Zakharova, just kind of too solid for her. Zakharova really does, play hyper aggressive, which is fine when she's getting a little bit more time. But Siegemund moves the ball well. Her business is being stingy with shots and competing well. Moving very well. Coming from the clay court background, she really moves the ball well with her forehand. Good win for her. I think Alexandrova should win. But given the loss last year at the AO, you expect this to be kind of close. The upset is always there with Siegemund because she just doesn't, she doesn't play outside of herself. She just plays her game and probes you and sees if you're willing to make errors, if you're willing to get frustrated, and, it can happen. So I like Alexandrova there in 3, but, risky spot. Kalinskaya here, still with the tape on her leg. I don't think anyone's ever beat a healthy Kalinskaya. And not trying to take jabs either. She seems genuinely injured at most tournaments. A lot of withdrawals in her past, which people tend to roll their eyes at withdrawals. But, if you're playing injured, you're kind of hopeful. You're hoping you're able to figure out some way to do it. I know everyone, it doesn't matter what injury you have. If you're heading into a competition, in your head, you're just able to think of a way where it could work out. You just decide, I'm going to be very accurate today, or I'll just serve volley. And then when you get out there and you realize, you physically can't, it doesn't mean that you just lose either. It means that you sort of know that you have an hour and a half left of knowing the outcome and clawing against it and being in pain and getting frustrated. And I think you see most players, if they win a rally, the leg doesn't hurt. But if they lose a rally, they look at the leg. And, it's a bit of projection. You'd rather see players be balanced, but it's true also. It's frustrating, when it happens. So not totally sure that Kalinskaya is going to be able to deal with Swiatek. Swiatek had a slight hiccup against Lamens, lost the second set. Things were pretty close in the third. I think that Lamens just played excellent, though, in the second set. She played a really high level. She hits the ball, the net clearance on her shots in that match in the second set were just really minimal. And, that's tough for Swiatek because she hits with a lot of topspin. So she tended to be kind of lifting the ball up, and Lamens was driving it. And, it's a good win. I think Swiatek beats Kalinskaya. Kalinskaya won in Dubai in 2024. That's a big win. But Swiatek's playing better on hard court now. And she just beat her 3-4 in Cincinnati a week ago. And that was a match where I thought Kalinskaya might do well. So now add a week of wear and tear on Kalinskaya's leg. Add in a bigger moment where Swiatek is likely to play a little bit better. So I think probably the same result. I really like Kalinskaya's game. I think, she played, when she played Swiatek there, she didn't look 100% either. Maybe she's in better shape this week. Hard to really say. She's moving okay, even though, the leg is taped up. But I think, she just looked a bit frustrated against Swiatek the other week. She was, up against it in a lot of service games. I think that'll be the case here. Swiatek did hit a couple big serves when she needed them against Lamens. I think very professional player. So I think Iga will be on the practice court, working on the stuff she had trouble with. I just think in rallies, Kalinskaya is going to have a slightly tougher time scoring on Swiatek with the ball in hand than Swiatek will. So I like Swiatek there. I think that's it. So I'll get out of here. Hope you have a good day. And I hope you, find like $400,000 in the floor or something, or like, or your tree grows good apples. I don't know what people are into, but take it easy.